Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you joining us on the weekends. We continue to broadcast Living in Mexico on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday from 7 to 8 a.m. through Grupo Imagen. And we're now podcasting more of these interviews. So if you're joining us live via YouTube streaming, I really appreciate you joining us. Today. There was we haven't spoken for the last couple of weeks regarding the results of the judicial elections that took place at the beginning of June. And part of the reason that I want to go back and just kind of review the results is that I think we were all waiting for this final meeting to take place at the National Electoral Institute to figure out, despite the enormous amount of information that was published, that has been provided to the electoral authorities, that there was I don't know if hanky panky is the best word to use. There was a lot of irregularities, cheating, basically. And there was kind of a sense that maybe the National Electoral Institute would kind of finally speak out against the way the elections took place. I don't know if we were expecting it to be annulled, but at least to review in detail who won, how they won, and why they won. Why were they candidates? Because there was also a series of question marks regarding many candidates. One, in fact, is in jail. There was a group of them that didn't have the sufficient, their grades weren't high enough, their law school grades weren't high enough that would allow them to be candidates, and they still were candidates and they won. And then there was just a series of irregularities that went from ballot boxes that had more votes than the number of people who could actually vote in that site. There was like 100% of every person in that community voted, which we know is not possible because nationwide, the elections, at least the number of people who could vote was only 13%. And of those 13%, 20% of those votes in many cases were annulled. So there was a lot of strange things happening. And finally, they met this week, and I'll let our following guest explain what happened this week because I'm just too exhausted to try to explain this. Carlos Ramirez, you know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's from Integralia. In fact, our friends in Integralia published another report this week. Carlos, welcome to the show. Let's just start with what happened this week. What were the conclusions of the National Electoral Institute?
Thank you, Ana Maria, for having me. It's always a pleasure. Well, yeah, formally this week, the National Electoral Institute had to qualify the overall
Certify.
election.
They had to certify it, right? They
Yeah,
had to certify it.
certify the election of June 1st. We already had, I mean, all the results, but there was formally a last step in which basically the 11 members of the National Electoral Institute had to basically declare the election as, let's say, a go, or else disqualify the election. They basically had to choose either one. And what was very interesting, and I would say sad in many ways, is that there was a split vote within the 11 members of the institute. Usually, when you are certifying an election, Ana Maria, and that had been the history of Mexican Electoral Institute, this last step was usually, let's say, something given in which basically all the members of the board of the institute basically declared that the election, okay, had some problems, but at the end of the day, it went well, so they certified the election.
And they certified it because they're just whatever went wrong didn't necessarily change the course or the result.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was relatively minor and small things, but definitely didn't change the course of the results. Well, this time was not like that. We had a split vote, 6-5, 6 in favor of certifying the election, But the 5 members of the board that basically voted for not certifying the election gave an impressive list of problems of the election, something we had never seen before. And the lists are relatively well known. We saw it with our own eyes. Nobody had to tell us. But certainly, these 5 board members made a long list of things that they thought it was changed the course of the election and was irregular or illegal. The most basic and more evident one was the famous cheat sheets, in which basically voters went to vote with already the given numbers that someone had suggested to them, and basically all of the 5 members that mentioned this said this was illegal. Political parties who obviously handled this cheat sheets to all the voters should never have participated because it was illegal. So it was clear that there was political participation in the process. And basically, the 6 members that declared the election as valid basically said, no problem. At the end of the day, the election went well. People went to vote. It was a free process.
Few people went to vote.
Yeah, few people. Few people. But anyway, the point is, the list of irregularities of this election is something we had never seen before. But notwithstanding this, 6 members, for very different reasons, but very clearly because of their closeness to the government, basically declared the election valid. And this is very concerning because Mexico's electoral integrity during the past 30 years, Mexico fought for a long time and invested a lot of money in creating an institution that basically guaranteed the election integrity. Well, now, 30 years later, we go through this process that was, as you know, since the beginning, full of irregularities and strange things. And now, basically, we have the results of the election given. Nothing can change anymore the result, and we know the result. The result is that the judicial branch is entirely captured by the administration, by the federal government. The autonomy of the judicial branch is gone, and Mexico is entering a new phase in its political life, in which basically the past 30 years was a time of checks and balances to the executive. That is gone now. The judicial branch will be favoring the interests of the executive. And now we have a new regime in which the concentration of power will be as it was, with obviously some differences, in the times of the hegemonic party of the PRI in the 70 years of this hegemonic party. So that, in a nutshell, is what we saw this week, Ana Maria.
So, what was also interesting is the, there was a couple, I mean, how they described what had happened. And this whole issue of these cheat sheets, which is known, it's known in Spanish acordeones, which basically, just so our audience understands what we're talking about, basically was a list of candidates that with their number, because by the way, you didn't write the name, they had a number assigned to them, which made it very, very confusing. In fact, I don't know if you went to vote. I went to vote just because I wanted to see what this was all about. And I'm a lawyer. I'm a Harvard lawyer. And I made mistakes even when I was trying to vote. It was very, very, very confusing. So I can imagine even in the counting of the votes, the complexity of how they counted the vote. Also, I'm sure we'll find out later, that maybe mistakes were made even in the counting of these votes. But beyond the process itself, what we're finding out is that people who should have not been candidates were candidates and they won. And these people are people who are on the list that was clearly, given out by Morena Party and its allies. So that's what is even more amazing. They could have tried to at least get qualified people on the ballot. You know what I mean? At least that they could pass, that they weren't like, abusing their wives, or they weren't, in jail for sexual abuse, or they hadn't been Chapo's lawyer. I mean, they just ended up with a whole bunch of people who also have really questionable backgrounds. And I guess the question is there still the possibility of people being, and once the investigation takes place, these candidates who won, who clearly don't have the necessary qualifications, will be able to, they're going to be, they're going to cancel their candidacy. I mean, is there still possibilities of that?
Only in very specific cases in which there could have been a mistake in terms of the way their name appeared in the ballot. But in essence, Ana Maria, I mean, yesterday the National Electoral Institute basically declared some of the judges elected as non-qualified because they didn't have grades necessary. But this is absurd because, I mean, that's not the work of the National Electoral Institute. That was the work of the committees that were expressly created for that purpose. So I'm sure that when it goes to the tribunal, the electoral tribunal, which is the last word on electoral matters in Mexico, and by the way, the electoral tribunal captured basically by Morena and its allies, basically the president of the tribunal is very close to the president. So we know what's going to happen there. They basically are going to bring down almost everything that the National Electoral Institute has expressed so far. But in any way, the problem, Ana Maria, is, I mean, it is quite absurd to bring down a candidate because it doesn't have an 8
exactly
in its grades, right?
Well, but if they're in jail, because I think one of the candidates is actually in jail, I think that's sufficient, don't you think? I mean, or he's been accused of sexual abuse. I mean, that should be sufficient, to disqualify you as a judge. It would be if there weren't elections, right?
Yeah, I mean, those cases maybe something will happen. But at the end of the day, there were a lot of names in the ballot, a lot of confusion, as you just stated. And at the end of the day, voters went to vote blind. The few people that showed up that didn't have this obviously sheet. I always say it the other way around. I mean, there were very few people that went to the ballot really to try to vote for some idea. But at the end of the day, the government did, I mean, the result of the election is what exactly the government wanted,
right,
which was an entire capture of the Supreme Court, an entire capture of this tribunal, the discipline tribunal, and federal judges are not going to be all people from the administration. I mean, but most of them 75% of them were proposed by the executive. So they still will have an incentive to vote and to decide on their judicial matters with the perspective of benefiting in some way or another the interest of the government. So, hey, these are relatively small things, what you're mentioning, right? They might be some people that basically they will strike down, but at the end of the day, the government basically was successful in what they pursued since day one. This, don't let us forget, began on February 5th, 2024, Lopez Obrador proposing the 18 constitutional reforms. the election on June 1st, in which Morena won by a landslide, the majority the big majority they constructed in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate by very questionable ways, and then the reform itself in Congress express fast, no discussion, and then the National Electoral Institute had to organize an election in very brief period of time. So it was since day one a disaster, Ana Maria. That's a reality.
So what happens now? I mean, I love this question. What's the end game? I mean, so they were successful. They had judicial elections. They have 75% of those who were elected. They may not be the most qualified judges, but at the end of the day, they have they are at least there is the perception, which may be reality, that they're close to Morena party. And I guess we have to assume that if cases come up and if there is interest of someone that belongs to the party or to the government, that they will decide in favor of whatever this defendant or needs, or
Yeah.
plaintiff, who is close to the government. But what do you get out of that when you consider the chaos that is going to be ensued for the next couple of years? I mean, yeah, the Supreme Court will decide in favor of most of the cases that, the president wants to be decided. But what's the end game?
The end game is, I would say, two major things that Morena wanted from this reform and from this election. One, entire control of the judicial branch, which in the mind of Morena, Lopez Obrador, Sheinbaum, the judicial branch was the last obstacle, the last check on the executive. And in the mind of this party, in many ways, the judicial branch was an obstacle on obtaining what? Their interests, being social, economic, being political, anything that has to do with the interest of the movement, the political movement called Morena. Well, this view of being an obstacle was very clear, and now it's gone. So that was the first and main purpose, taking out the obstacle. So now Sheinbaum will basically rule without checks and balances, and basically will have the possibility of deciding anything.
But what do they want? You know what I mean?
They want control, they want the power, and one more thing, which was also very important. Also, they want the guarantee of continuity. The fact is that with now the control of the judicial branch, Morena has a huge advantage over the rest of the political parties. And most likely, this will allow Morena to stay in power for many years. So it is also the fact of guaranteeing continuity. So yeah, it's concerning from a business perspective. I mean, the companies, investors will have to learn to live with this new reality. It is not that Mexico will not offer opportunities of investment because of this. Clearly, during the PRI,
that's what I was going to say. We're going back to the PRI world of the 70s and 80s, where pretty much the PRI co-opted the political establishment, including in many ways the opposition, and they also co-opted the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. And if anything, if you were a business person, you basically had to work with the PRI. I mean, I think that's what they're going to try.
That's exactly what's going to happen. Yeah.
I just don't know if they're going to be able to do that, because the PRI, of the 70s and 80s, and even a certain part of the 90s, was a party that really did exercise control uh, amongst themselves because the
Yes.
opposition was within themselves. That's when the PR was weakened, was when individuals within the PRI, including Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas
Yes.
and all that group of people, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who was part of the PRI.
Yeah.
That's when it weakened, was when they had parts of the PRI breaking off, which seems to is going to be the big challenge of the current president to try to keep Morena united enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's probably the big question. And actually, to answer your previous question on the end game.
Mm-hmm.
So the big question is, we're going back basically 40, 50 years uh, behind in terms of institutional development, right?
Right.
The checks and balances are gone. The power is now concentrated again in the executive. But this executive, as you are mentioning, it's not entirely in control as it was
Mm-hmm.
40, 50 years, because this party movement is much more fragmented. Within
Right.
there are many, many interests and many different factions.
Mm-hmm.
And they are basically, they don't like each other, actually.
Yes,
So,
that's
so yeah, the big question is, how will all this concentration of power will combine with this fragmentation within the party? But at the end of the
mm-hmm.
day, they obtained the two things they wanted: no more obstacles, and
Mm-hmm.
the guarantee that they will remain in power for many, many years.
So, what are the checks and balances right now in Mexico's democracy? I mean, I think still the central bank, el Banco de Mexico, continues to have a certain level of independence.
Yeah.
Um, I think the U.S. government's policies, in many ways, exercise a certain level of checks and balances, whether the Mexican government likes it or not. Um, but I don't see the business community being able to confront or
No,
willing to confront the federal government or Morena. I don't see clearly. There's no opposition in Mexico. I mean, there's none, and there's not even by this. If you would recall prior years in the last 20 years, we at this stage a year, as we're what is it, 6 months, 7 months since Claudia Sheinbaum came into office,
no.
at this stage, in other administrations, we were already talking about possible presidential candidates. I mean, which you think is funny, but right now there's nobody. I mean, and nobody. I
Um,
mean, there is literally, give me one name of a person who could potentially be a presidential candidate in 2030. I mean,
there's
it's just, it's just not there unless you say it's someone from Morena. But even within Morena, they're, everybody's kind of looking at the son of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. But, there also starts to seem to be some question marks just because of the way he's behaving and the
yeah,
way the party's behaving. But you understand my question. I mean, I don't
absolutely.
even foresee any checks and balances. The media, clearly, we can talk about it. We can underline, we can say this is very dangerous, but I don't think we no longer have the
No,
capacity to change people's minds in regarding what's happening.
no, definitely.
We can inform, we try to
Yeah.
inform, but we don't, I don't think people change, they're not willing to change their mind anymore.
No, no, the media in Mexico, to be honest, has always been weak. Yeah, there was a period of time in which some media
Yeah,
outlets started to gain autonomy and started to become more important, but that time is gone. I mean,
yeah.
right now, media is in a very weak position. So we don't have more autonomous institutions. There's no more judicial branch. The legislative is no, I mean,
Mm,
is clearly not a counterbalances. The opposition doesn't exist almost entirely, and it's going to take years before we
mm,
start to see some really opposition to start to gain ground.
mm-hmm,
So what are the checks and balances? Yeah, you mentioned the central bank.
mm-hmm,
In many ways, yes. I would, although clearly with some favor and some like people that like the government, but clearly it remains an autonomous institution. The government is not messing around with a central bank. I would argue that the markets are very important. Clearly, the
Yeah.
business community is not a check and balance. It hasn't been, never has been a check and balance, but it's now not a check and balance.
Hmm.
The business community has to guarantee stability and has to guarantee that businesses go well. They are not going to go and
Fight. They're
defend
not going to fight it.
democracy. Right?
Yeah.
So the US, but for the wrong reasons, because we have Trump in the presidency.
Right.
Really, Trump doesn't care about Mexican democracy in Mexico in overall terms. But now
Hmm.
he's pressuring Mexico for different reasons. But yeah, that helps a bit. Financial markets. So the big difference with what, and I'll end here. The big difference with what we have right now that it was not present 40 years ago, 50
Hmm.
years ago, is that Mexico has an investment grade. Mexico's macroeconomy is relatively stable.
Hmm.
Inflation is down, relatively under control. Um, the exchange rate floats and actually has been behaving very well, even with much more political risk. So that macro stability in itself is a check in the administration because the administration doesn't want to lose that macroeconomic stability. So obviously takes care on our credit ratings, on the
Hmm.
level of debt. So it is not going crazy as it
Hmm.
happened in the 70s when Lopez Portillo and Echeverria basically threw everything away because, I mean, for reasons you already know. But the point is, there are a few checks. Most of them are more indirect. The
Hmm.
market, the US, the central bank in many ways. But politically speaking, there are not many, Ana Maria.
No,
There are
there's
not.
no. No. Morena, the division in Morena. The infights in Morena, I guess, is going to end up being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, it's always great to talk to you. If anybody wants to read this report or have access to this report, where would they go?
Integralia.com.mx in our webpage. You can
Right.
find it there and download it.
Okay. I really appreciate you joining us this weekend, Carlos Ramirez from Integral. It's always enjoyed talking to you, although sometimes after these conversations, I walk away with, I don't know, a big, a, a lot of pessimism, I guess is the word. Or, I don't know if it's pessimism, just concern, just concern. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Carlos
Thank you, Ana Maria.
Ramirez.
Thank you for
You're
having me.
Thank you, and thank you. We're gonna go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Don't go away. I'll be right back.